If you find you're unsettled listening today, reach out to a trusted friend or go to tradespodcast.com and click on resources.
We are men in the trades, forging health in the drug poisoning crisis. This is
Off the Clock Toolbox Talk.
Hey everybody, we're back today with an episode about drugs and construction work and addiction. And we have Dr. Jeremy Milloy with us in today. Thanks for being here, Jeremy.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
We also have Trevor Botkin back co-hosting with us today. Welcome, Trevor.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Karen. Super excited about this episode.
Jeremy is a scholar who researches about work and violence at work and addiction and capitalism and how all of those things are connected together. And I'm not even going to try to do any more preamble than that, because once Jeremy starts linking all these things together, my mind was blown the first time I heard him talk about, like, because there is this presence of substance use in the trades and construction. And I always just thought it was kind of by accident, or like, I didn't know why that was so prolific, but there's really good reasons why that is the way that it is. So yeah, Jeremy, do you want to just jump in and
Sure, talking a little bit about how I began to look at this from a historical point of view.
yeah.
Basically, like you mentioned, when I was doing my PhD research, which became my first book, I was interested in violence in the workplace and like why it was happening. And for a very similar reason to why you guys do the show that you do, is that by getting more knowledge out there about something, that there will be better outcomes for people and an ability to move past the problem just kind of going around and around and actually making some real progress. And being trained as a historian, I believe it's super fundamental to like understand the actual history of something. So somebody who's interested in work and the role it plays in our life, because I really think that our jobs play such a huge role in our identities and our connections and our community and the outcomes we have in our life, the people that we meet, our health, all of those things. I was really interested in the phenomenon of workplace violence, and I was coming up at a time, this is 15 years ago, when every workplace was having policies, right? And I'm from Ontario originally. We had a bill going through Parliament that every employer had to have a workplace violence policy, and all the stuff I read about it, though, started kind of assuming that it was like this brand new problem, that workplace violence had not really happened until like the 80s and 90s, when, you've probably heard the term going postal, when people, especially down in the US where I currently live, were coming to workplaces with guns and doing real damage, shooting multiple people. And there was an assumption that like this was new. And, being a historian, one of the first questions we always ask is like, what did this used to look like? And not assuming that something is a new phenomenon. So I really got interested in trying to look at the history of it. And so I went back before the 80s, looking at the 70s and 60s and 50s. And I looked at one specific industry, auto, because auto is such an important industry in North America. And being a Canadian, growing up hearing a lot about how different we are with violence in the United States, but also growing up in a Canadian culture where there was violence all around me when I was a kid. Fortunately, I didn't see people shoot each other with guns, but growing up in a small town in Canada, going to boarding school, there's like lots of elements of my life, being a hockey fan, where I just saw violence all the time, right? I was like, in some senses, Canada is definitely less violent, but I also thought violence was part of our story that I wanted to know more about. Particularly with how we socialize young men and working class men too. And so, and females too, but in different ways. So I started looking at the history, and the auto industry lets you compare the US and Canada, right? Because we had the same union operating both sides of the border. We had the same companies operating both sides of the border. So I could really do like an apples to apples comparison. And what I found out was, even before the 80s and 90s, there was a significant amount of violence in these workplaces that workers were experiencing and using. And some of that was like hazing, which I've heard you talk about on your show before, and it's very common in auto too, and just to prove that you could make it there. And I had the privilege of interviewing one of the first female workers at Chrysler in the 70s. Chrysler didn't have female workers in Windsor until the federal government basically forced them to kind of open the doors a little bit more. And she told me about being harassed on the job, violence on the job, being followed after the job, having people drive back and forth around her house, and that
Wow.
when she reported it to brothers in the union, the response was very possibly violent, that they went and sort that guy out one way or the other, right? So
Yeah.
violence was happening in these workplaces and used in all different ways. And particularly I found the biggest things causing violence were things like sexism, racism, and just changes in the labor process. The harder they were pushing people, and in the 60s and 70s, especially here in Detroit, Chrysler started pushing people really hard to compete with Japanese imports, to compete with German imports, to compete with the rest of the big three. And they didn't have as much capital as some of the other companies. So the way they had to push it wasn't through new technology, it was by pushing the people they had in the workplaces to get more cars out and hiring more supervisors to yell at them more and intimidate them more. And that created a pressure cooker where people were opting to use violence all over the place. And so that really instilled in me and some insights from critical public health and my brother, Michael John, who's at UBC, who I think you met, is a critical public health epidemiologist, really inspired me to think of it's not just what's inside people, it's what we put around people and the choices that they have and the supports that they have and what life looks like to them that influences their choices.
Mhm.
I always say to people, Chrysler didn't just hire a bunch of bad people in the late 1960s, right? They
Yeah.
weren't
Yeah.
going through resumes saying, have you ever, had an assault charge or whatever? They were putting people into situations where it was really likely that they would choose violence as a result of what was going on around them.
This
And
is
so maybe-
blowing my mind because this
Yeah.
is so much like the construction industry and, all of the
100%.
same tactics of, hire
Yeah.
more people to yell at them more and stuff. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, that's exactly the same tools that's used in the construction, or at least it has been up until now. It's changed. It's starting to change now, but yeah, historically.
And my mind jumps to, like many people do when we talk about workplace violence. My mind jumps to the idea of somebody, going postal or bringing a gun
Yeah.
to work or some sort of
Yeah.
violence around that. But we're talking about a lot more things here that fall under the umbrella of workplace violence, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that really stood out to me that was really startling, shocking even, was how many things there was one or two shootings that I found in the records. I went through every record I could for Chrysler in Detroit and Windsor from 1950 to 75. And how many other like things that we would consider like really severe, people hitting each other with a pipe or a crowbar or a stabbing, something like that. But like I was always cognizant from just knowing how things work and my own experience with violence and talking to other people about their workplace experiences, that there's so much that would never make it into a grievance, never make it into a report.
Right.
And that could be, things like a beating, or it could be just, like what we would call a microaggression now, like what happened to the person I talked to in Windsor, being followed around, having comments made to you. There's a whole spectrum and
Paying your dues, right?
and a lot of it's considered paying your dues.
Yeah.
The term that would come up over and over again in my mind and because I saw it in the records and in talking to people was part of the job.
right.
It was part of the job. And
Just normalized.
it was just like what we accept as part of the job and what changes in life when we cross onto a factory or a job site. It's like it's never left me that thinking that like the rules just become different and people get away with things that if you did them, on a street corner or in a restaurant or in a park, like it would be
Arrested.
completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
But we tolerate
100%.
that because it's supposed to come with the job, it's supposed to come with a paycheck, which is really something. So, this was true. Certainly, American workplaces were more violent, but there was certainly a significant amount of violence in the Canadian workplaces too. Things like hazing, paying your dues, enforcing codes of conduct, whether, and I think it's probably true in construction too, not just in the plant, right, but also in the bars after work, in the parking
Totally.
lot. So that, that led into one of the other things I saw researching these workplaces, and again, this jibed with experiences in my own life and workplaces I'd seen, was how many people were really experiencing a lot of issues and a lot of heartbreak and a lot of bad outcomes from substance use. Just a lot of alcohol. In the Detroit plants, a lot of heroin. We talk about the opioid crisis now, and it's certainly got different features than previous ones, but there's been reoccurring opioid crises going back to the Civil War when soldiers were widely given opioids to deal with the traumas and injuries they suffered during wartime, right?
Wow.
So that was, and I kind of grew to see them again as part of this spectrum, that there are these conditions that people were being put under, which were not humane and not, helpful for their body or their spirit to flourish. And some people were pushing violence out towards other people, towards coworkers, supervisors, spouses, kids. And some people were pushing it inwards, right? Some people were using in a way that was really, really harmful to themselves. And so that inspired this project.
I can hear so much of my own experience in some of the details you're bringing up.
Yeah, my mind is blown, like, just when you put it in that context, and like, we're all busting through just trying to get the job done, trying to yeah, I just think of the work sites that we visited, promoting the podcast, and just how people are busting their asses just to get things done. And when you put it in this large historical context, it's just like, what are we doing? How did this happen? Like, I find it fascinating to take that broader perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm really fortunate I get to teach history, and one of the things we talk in class about is like, why is it important to learn history? And sometimes, people will say, so we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past. And, I always joke a lot of the times we're not in the position to do that. Not with like the major historical questions. Like, I'm never really going to be asked, should I start a land war in Asia or not? It's not going to come up for me. But
Yeah.
I tell students that having a set of tools that historians have, that studying history gives you, is thinking about that long arc of how things go over time.
Yeah.
Because life is, hopefully for most of us, a marathon. It is going to be a long period. And we can get so involved in short-term thinking in our society. I've got the election on my mind down here, but and everybody talks in elections about 2-year, 4-year cycles, right?
Right.
And if you're like, if you think about the environment, the life of a tree or a river or a human being is much longer than 2 or 4 years, and actually needs to be thought about in those longer cycles. And at a workplace, so often the desires of capital and the demands of employers are really short term, to get the next project done, to get the next thing out, to get this model year of car out, and you burn through people to get that done. And whatever's left at the end, like, that's not your problem. You move on, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. You burn through people,
really
and you
do.
burn up their bodies.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and the coworkers, we're programmed for that too. Like, I lacked foresight. Like, I wasn't making decisions with my body in my output at 25 years old that was going to be sustainable. And I think one of the real challenges with me, and I think we mentioned this in the last episode, but I came to a point around 30 where I blew my back. I had to have my back fused. I was 29 years old, and it became really, obvious to me, like, wow, I mean, I don't have anywhere else to go. This is how I make a living. Everything, my daughter's futures relies on me showing up every day in this industry. And where I used to be really proud about how hard the job was and how hard I had to work and that I could do it, now I felt really stuck. Like, I got to keep doing this now for 20, 30, 40 years, however long it's going to be. Like, it was a really tough moment for me to accept that. And I think that's probably one of the places where my mental health really started to take like an obvious turn for the worst, was this feeling of being stuck in a place that was really hard. And
it must have been really scary too, right? Because you're like, well, if this doesn't get better, if my condition gets worse, then I can't earn.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I've got medical professionals who have honestly been looking out for me every time I went to see one. And I never listened to, because I couldn't, the industry didn't allow me to take 2 weeks off every time my doctor said, take 2 weeks off for that muscle strain. It was really scary, because I was just like, I don't know. I think it was the first time I really felt super vulnerable in my career. Like, oh, I'm not just unbreakable. I'm not the toughest thing on the planet.
But you never let that show at the work site.
No, you couldn't.
No.
Who do I talk to?
So I like that you're talking about it now, because that gives people permission to start talking about it too. But of course, you never showed that on the work site, so people
look what I had to go through to get here, though.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Seriously, and a lot of guys. I'm not alone. I'm certainly not alone in that. But but it's a tough place to be when you're in an industry that is it's counting on you, and pushing you hard to, like, we are what makes up the difference when they're out there in a bidding war for a project. They're bidding how little it's going to cost to do the job.
Yeah.
But that comes out of my back.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
comes out of the backs of the men and women who line up on those job sites to do that. So they're making, they're writing checks that you got to cash. And it's, and I think I've been part of that problem, obviously, as a young leader on job sites. And then I was the one dishing it out, right? Pushing on guys. You got to get this done. I can hear myself clearly saying, leave your personal lives at home. If you can't cut it, we need you here. And if you're not going to be here, we'll find somebody that can be. Right? Like I was that guy, and it took its toll on a lot of people. And I was the recipient of that too, right? So,
It's good to point out though that you're in the middle of that dynamic, right?
Yeah.
Like that's how the bid process works, and like it was like ever thus. Like this is the story of the way that we work under capitalism. And researching this book, there was a book called Muscle and Blood I read by Rachel Scott, which is old book now, but she was a journalist, great book, and so much was still relevant. She found out that Chrysler figured out how much would it cost to slow down the line and like make the plants humane versus how much they'd have to pay out to, that so your profits are lower versus running the plants as hard as you can humanly get away with and deal with the workman's comp costs and the cost for benefiting families who people literally died on the job. And they said, well, it's going to be cheaper to do the latter, so we're gonna go all out. And those are the kind of calculations that ultimately people pay for with their bodies and unfortunately in some cases with their lives. And it's interesting because a lot of workplace health culture and advice, like the workplace violence stuff, is extremely individualized. But you can't do that if you're part of a team, if you're part of
Right.
if you're part of a job that has to get finished at a certain time. People say, well, you need to do X, Y, and Z to take care of your health. But if your employer is not going to back that, then you're completely putting a rock in a hard place.
I've repeatedly been in this situation in my life where people are telling me, you got to take time away. We need you to get some rest. We need you, but every time I do, the team falls apart. And not because it's just because it's not because I'm amazing. It's just because it relies so much on 4 people being there, say.
Yeah.
And when you take one of those pillars out, things drop. I come back to work. I'm away from work, have anxiety about what I'm missing and what I'm not a part of. And when I get back there's all this other stuff and we're behind and we have all this stuff. Again, not because I'm amazing, but because there's no wiggle room. You can't lose any one of the pillars.
Yeah.
And that's a wiggle room like under in terms of persons. If there was more people on your team, then it'd be easier to take one person away, right? Like I'm in a union environment right now, and we had a meeting where we talked about our health and disability policies and just blue sky stuff, like what would you like to see? And somebody was like, 2 things came up: how hard it is to talk to your supervisor about health terms because you're automatically at cross purposes, right?
Yeah.
You need to talk. Is the person going to support your health, or are they going to support, well, we need your unit to keep producing, right?
Yeah.
And the feeling of everyone, and the environment I work is obviously university, it's different, but a lot of similar dynamics are there. And in terms of people's health and what people feel like they can and can't do, university staff have been, cut to the bone over the past 20 or 30 years. And so people say, I don't feel like I can take the time for my health because I feel like I'm letting my team down.
Yes.
And that's really hard because I want the people that I work with to be healthy and happy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like I understand what I would feel but I would feel the exact same way. If somebody, if I had to go out for 4 months and my colleague was teaching my classes or whatever, I would feel awful for them.
Yeah. And there's, and if they need that kind of worker, they have to build it. There has to be a culture present that develops that kind of mindset that we are here, like our loyalty to our company or to our employer is greater than the loyalty we have to ourselves. and tying that to like I'm running myself into my ground for the company, but I'm also running myself into my ground for my coworker and for my kids and for my, right? Like I was brought up in a culture that right from my father, actually, that taught me that that's what you do as a man. I mean, this is, and then I went into a trade as a carpenter in the construction sector that, again, my journeys who brought me up through the industry they again instilled that logic inside of me.
For sure. And growing up, male identified in our culture, and I watched a lot of sports, still do, and
Right.
the amount of hosannas that people would get because they play through the pain, right? Because they play hurt, because their teammates need them, and they go out there. Two things I even saw in the past week. Joel Embiid, the best player in the Philadelphia 76ers, who's gone through all kinds of injuries, he's taking like the first couple months off because his knee's still a problem. And he's getting widespread media attention, people calling him out, saying he's letting everybody down, and how dare he do this? And he thinks that like he needs to rest now so he can be there for his teammates when it's more important, but that's not really respected at all in our culture still.
I remember, notoriously Simone Biles, the gymnast, like
Yeah.
her story around mental health, and not physical injury, but mental health challenges, and having to take space for her, and the vitriol that she was confronted by her fans and by supporters of gymnastics. It's insane. It's insanity.
We talk a good game about this stuff until somebody's money's on the line.
Totally.
And with Simone, it was a lot of sponsors, a lot of TV networks wanted her on TV for those competitions, and she wasn't. And
right.
You hear the NFL, you can't walk a foot here without hearing about football. And they always say all the time, there's a difference between hurt and injured.
Yeah.
It's the difference between hurt and injured. And
That's
I know
right.
what they mean, but I also think it's a really devastating message for young people to be taking in every week.
Yeah.
It is, because the reality for like a young guy like I was, or for anybody coming up after me, is that professional athlete, he can risk more, because at the end of the day, if it ends his career, he's fallen back on how many millions of dollars he or she has probably built a decent, has some security sitting there. That person can afford to be more risk averse. I'm not saying they don't deserve the time off as much. They do, clearly. But when I walk onto a job site and I take those risks and I push myself back past the limit, and I end up, honestly, with a substance use challenge that the industry didn't give me, but definitely, it wasn't a healthy space to be in as a substance user. Ended me in a treatment center where I had no money. I had to take money from my mom to pay for. My personal decision was I couldn't work in that industry anymore, and I had to find a different way of living, right? I had to bite the bullet and take the hit. It wasn't like I found a way, but you didn't know that at the time. So we're asking people to be have lower risk aversion, but the reality is the risks are huge for the individuals working in factories, working on job sites, because there's no backup. There's no backup. And you may not be physically capable of taking on another job somewhere else.
Absolutely. And even for a lot of the NFL guys, the vast majority of those people are going through the league in 2 to 3 years, and whatever, they make good money for 2 to 3 years, but that doesn't go very far for very long. A lot of those guys are in a real tough spot within 5 years, if you're not a Tom Brady or a Randy Moss or whatever. With people working in blue collar jobs, people working as nurses, anything that requires you to be on your feet, to be physically sacrificing to get something done. You're right, though, that once that's over, and if you can't make it in that field anymore because you're physically unable or you're mentally unable, they're not there for you, right? Then you are left to pick up the pieces and move on and find something else. So again, the time period when you're 23, 24, these guys you're not going to think about that. Young women aren't going to think about that. They're just going to be like, I can earn, I feel great. I got to do this. I got to keep up with the people beside me. And it is really kind of inherent in terms of what actually management leadership is, for people to be looking out long-term for these folks. But all the incentives point the other way, that you've got these young bodies and to strike while the iron's hot, and they're going to be left with the consequences down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we jump specifically into addiction and start talking just about substance use and its connection to blue collar, or maybe just work? I don't know. You can tell me about that.
Yeah, so I got interested, as I said, doing the first project on what the relationship was between people's jobs and their substance use behavior, and the kind of impacts it had on their lives. There's a few different things that stuck out with me while researching this. And I do think there are substance use cultures and substance abuse or substance use disorder cultures in all kinds of workplaces. Blue collar, white collar, Whether that's you hear people at JP Morgan working 70-hour weeks while they're new to try and prove themselves and being up all night doing Adderall and cocaine so that they can meet that kind of workload. The truck driver use of stimulants, the kind of cultures in medicine with the amount of medication around. Certainly an industry I've worked in, restaurant and bar, the hours people keep, the level of encouragement of drinking and drug use in those industries. So it really does cut across the spectrum of employment, I would say. It's multifaceted, but the big story I'm trying to tell is in the late 60s, early 70s, a big change was there was a belief that drug and alcohol use was a really big problem for employers in Canada and the US. This hadn't been thought of. This was something that I think had been seen as like an individual issue before then, but people saw it as a structural issue. Like we have too many workers that are having these problems, and I think this is reflecting of like 12-step and people in 12-step recovery becoming more present in life, even if they weren't always out about it with respect to the tradition of anonymity. The belief that you could do something about it. Like there was a belief before, I think, that you just give up on people, and if somebody can't keep their shit together, you fire them, and that's it. Right now, there were so many more people carrying the message that this is a disease and you can't recover, and those folks started having more influence in workplaces and in government. And so in the early 70s, the belief like, okay, we've got this big problem with it. What's costing us all this money in terms of productivity, in terms of absenteeism, in terms of training new people when you have to fire someone, all this stuff. But the good news is we can do something about it. And here's where the real key is for understanding how this works in the workplace. Not just we can do something about it. There was a belief in the late 60s and early 70s that the workplace was the key area in society that people could make an impact in substance use disorder, or what we would call addiction back then. Because if you think about, America and Canada in the 60s and 70s, right? You're thinking of drug use is becoming noticeably more mainstream with hippies and the rise of the counterculture. It's a huge baby boom. So there's all these young people, and we know, young people tend to party more, they tend to drink more, they tend to do more drugs. So these things are very visible in society, and people are really concerned. And down here in the US, people are really concerned that service people are getting hooked on heroin in Vietnam and are going to bring that back and not be able to compete in the workplace. So all these things happen, but there's this real belief that work is the place that you can make people change. And everything was built around a new model that they called constructive coercion. And the belief was,
constructive coercion.
Constructive coercion. You could probably make a pretty good construction industry podcast with that title, I would imagine.
Yeah, great. Yeah, super helpful title.
To find out more about what the hell constructive coercion is and more on this enlightening conversation, catch Constructive Coercion is a Thing, Part 2, released November 18th, 2024. Off the Clock Toolbox Talk has been a Fraser House Society project, executive produced and co-hosted by Karen Jansen, managed by Delan Young on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. Production of this material has been made in part through a financial contribution from Health Canada. The views expressed herein do not necessarily reflect the views of Health Canada or Fraser House Society. The content of this podcast is conversation between people with living experience and should not be taken as professional advice. Special shout out to the new PPE for making a difference in the lives of construction workers and the community in general. thenewppe.org. Help save lives. Go to tradespodcast.com and click on the link under Enter to win a $200 grocery card. When you fill out the survey, you help us understand what's working and what's not. Each survey for each episode listened to is a separate entry. Information collected is for survey purposes only and is not shared. Help us, help you.